I wanted to share some thoughts with you about the movie Oppenheimer. If you haven't watched it, do that first, otherwise I'll spoil it for you. This movie, I think, is about the end of the world and the beginning of a world. To be more specific, it's about the end of the last world and the beginning of the world we've lived in our entire lives. The post-war global order that was established by the events of the film, namely the invention of the atomic bomb. A decade from now, we may very well be in the next world, the next order, because it seems that we are in the last years of this post-war world, and simultaneously the beginning years of a new world. And that's why I think this movie is important. There's often something of the beginning of the world in its end. And so I've found myself paying more attention to the events that led to the creation of our world. To cut to the chase, our world, this post-war world, began with death. The death of hundreds of thousands of innocent people in an instant, and the creation of the means to wipe out all of mankind, justified by the fact that it would end a season of killing in the world of millions and millions, the likes of which the world had never before seen, conquering death by death. And I think it's interesting because many worlds, maybe most, are created this way, with a murder, with a sin, framed as a sacrifice to create a greater peace. That sounds so counterintuitive, but think about it. So many cultures, so many worlds, so many epics and eons began that way. And the thing is, it often works, at least for a time. I mean, it did in this case. This post-war world has been glorious, you have to admit, with power and wealth and pleasure and life and possibility that is literally incomprehensible. Nobody can even comprehend the complete complexity of this world, its economies and systems and networks. But when you create the world on something that ultimately might best be described as a sin, a transgression of necessity perhaps, but nonetheless a sin, it's like you incur a massive debt, I think, and you put off payment of that debt in a way that will eventually come due, maybe even all at once. So we also shouldn't be surprised that that kind of debt mentality has pervaded this world and also may contribute to its ultimate demise. Now, to understand the nature of this debt and what the film Oppenheimer might have to teach us about its moment and hence our moment in time, I think it's useful to use two mythic frameworks that I think you're already familiar with. The first is the framework suggested in the title of the book on which the film Oppenheimer was based, American Prometheus. This immediately places us into the framework of the Greek gods, a pantheon of powerful beings governing this world, but not necessarily good beings, noble beings. The Greek gods, they're slaves to their own passions, regularly participating in lust and greed, pride, deception, and the like. Prometheus, he's a titan, an unusually sympathetic Greek god, because he's the one that steals fire from the other gods in order to help humanity be able to survive. And for his well-intentioned acts, Prometheus angers the gods and receives a brutal punishment. Oppenheimer is an American Prometheus, like the title of that book says. He's a powerful intellect, a demigod, if you will, who works for the good of humanity, right, by stealing fire from the gods in order to allow mankind to survive when its very life is threatened. And certainly that was the case during the war. And for his well-intentioned acts, as the movie shows, he was ultimately rewarded with punishment by the other powerful figures of American society. This likeness to the Greek pantheon is a fitting framework, I think, because Oppenheimer and the figures acting in the creation of the atomic bomb were much like the Greek gods. Powerful, people, but ultimately flawed people. People capable of embodying principles of nobility and wisdom, and we see that. But just like we find within the Greek mythological stories, these are also people subject to all the usual passions. So even Oppenheimer has to wrestle with the wisdom of his actions as the world he has helped create, while achieving a certain peace and prosperity began with death and destruction. And this new world has those tragic flaws of its creators woven into its foundations, ever threatening to break out and destroy things again, using these new titanic forces that were recently harnessed. And so I asked myself, would it have been possible to create a world without these sins built into it, without these passions, swirling about, built into the very foundation? I don't know the answer to that question. But to try to answer that, I want to jump to another mythological framework that I think will be even more familiar to you than the Greek pantheon, because I see this as the most potent myth of our current world, given that it was written during the formation of our post-war world and released immediately after its founding. And that, of course, is Lord of the Rings. In Lord of the Rings, you have this dark power, Sauron, and he's gathering strength in the east, threatening to spread a reign of tyranny into the lands of men and other people in the west, right at the time when the last vestiges of a more enchanted ancient world, the elves, were departing the world. And the fate of both sides depend on finding and wielding this ring of power, the concentration of power itself for the rule and domination of the world. And the story, of course, revolves around finding the ring and deciding what to do with it. Sauron would use it to dominate all peoples. But under the providence of the creator of the world, Iluvatar, and you've got to read the Silmarillion, of course, to get more of this backstory, you have this band in The Lord of the Rings, a band of humble characters finding the ring first. And instead of using it themselves, they resist the temptation to put it on and decide that the only responsible thing to do is destroy the ring so that nobody else can use it. Even though I don't think Lord of the Rings was written as an allegory for the conditions of World War II, because Tolkien was very explicit about this, he dislikes allegory, the patterns of the story correspond relevantly to thinking mythologically about World War II and Oppenheimer, I think. World War II was certainly a war of the ring of power. It was all about who could find the ring of power first and what they would do with it. I mean, it's clear what the Nazis would do with it. Their entire philosophy was about manifesting strength and power and using it to dominate the weak. And so they ultimately pit their power against the world in a contest, a challenge of which society could manifest the most power, and then what would they do with it. And it wasn't just a contest of existing power that existed there at the beginning of the war, but which society could find even more power during the contest. Power of resources, but especially power of technology. And the ultimate question was whether a society could find an ultimate ring of power, a concentration of power so great that it could be used to bring all the other peoples into submission. And of course, as it played out historically, as we see in Oppenheimer, in World War II, the ring of power was discovered, but it wasn't by Bilbo or Frodo or Sam or Gandalf or Aragorn. I think it's more like Boromir discovered it first. Somebody who has noble intentions, but somebody not in complete control of his passions, who represented a people with certain nobility, for sure, in Gondor, but mixed with human frailty. And so the ring was put on in World War II and wielded by well-intentioned people. Death and power inflicted to create peace. And of course, we need to be fair in all this, because at the end of the day, try as you may, you can't make the case that Oppenheimer or Truman or the United States were just a new Sauron. The United States, if you think about it, could have been Sauron at that moment, after the creation of the atomic bomb and before any other country had it, because there was that space of time. But I think that the God that triumphed in World War II wasn't the God of tyranny or the God of war, but it also wasn't the God of Israel. It was the God of commerce, of economy, of profit, mammon, if you will. The United States used the ring to create the geopolitical framework of trade that created this tremendous amount of wealth and material prosperity that we've experienced our entire lives and in the last several generations. And for sure, there are far more nobler principles than this being the God that triumphed in the war. But there are far worse as well, you have to admit. Hence the mixed nature of our world. And so we turn to asking, how is this all relevant to ourselves? Well, just like Lord of the Rings, where that story takes place, once again, I think we're at the end of an age. Another War of the Ring may be brewing on our horizon, as this post-war world that we've been living in seems to be coming to its end, and birthing pains are beginning for the emergence of a new world. And so it's Lord of the Rings and a contest of the Greek gods all over again, perhaps. So how will it all play out? I don't think anybody knows. But the key question that I'm really left thinking about is, what would it mean today if instead of somebody like Oppenheimer and the people around him finding the ring and putting it on, what would it mean today for Bilbo or Frodo to find the ring? What would it mean for a future ring of power to be secretly taken to Mount Doom and destroyed instead of wielded, as it usually always has been throughout human history? And who would be the people humble enough and good enough to do that? Moving to the other Greek god framework, is it possible for the reign of these petty gods to end once and for all? For humans to instead choose to worship a most high God, a good God, finally, a fully good God? Is that even possible? Or are we bound to these same cycles of new and ever more destructive wars of the ring until we destroy the world altogether in fire or something else that we discover? I think the answers are coming.